Hello, everyone. Kind of boxed myself into a corner here, but welcome to the Patten Free Library. Thanks for coming tonight. This is part of our PFL Author Talk series, first one we've had in a while. And we're really excited because Shannon is not only a really great author and an award-winning author, but she also works here at the library behind the scenes, seeing all the books first before anyone else. So that makes this event extra special for us. And Terry from Mockingbird Bookshop is back there. You can buy books and Shannon will sign them afterwards. And if you are joining us on Zoom, we haven't forgotten you. Welcome. Also, this is set up as a webinar, so if you're joining us on Zoom, you won't be able to talk, but if you have any questions or comments for Shannon at the Q&A portion, just go ahead and type them in the Q&A with the chat, and I will relay them to her when the time comes.
Okay.
All right, it's all yours.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here in my own library, talking about my own book. It's kind of a dream come true. Oh, we have some people who have to sit in the front. So I'm Shannon Bowring, and I wrote The Road to Dalton, which when I give my little elevator speech, I say it's set in 1990, and it's inspired by my hometown in Aroostook County of about 1,300 people, and it follows a trajectory of several different characters through the course of 1 year, and something bad happens, and you kind of see the trajectory after that, how everybody's lives change. It's really hard to talk about the book without giving spoilers away, so I can only be the annoying person that gives oblique things like that. There's an event, is what I can say. How many have read the book? Oh, so I could give spoilers, but for the few who haven't, I'll hold back. So I feel like the best way to kind of kick this off is to read you just a little bit of the prologue to put you right in the place, because the place is the thing in this book. Imagine this. You are driving alone on a road in northern Maine. Your head still humming from the monotonous drone of I-95, that empty highway. On the radio, nothing but static and outdated country music. A couple miles back, you passed a dingy tagging station where men in orange wool hats and vests stood beneath a massive wooden scale, bull moose hanging upside down before them, dark blood on the dirt, dead tongue out of the mouth and flapping. The scene passed by so fast, you wonder if you only dreamed it. All those men, laughing as the moose swung in the bitter wind. This is Aroostook County. And it admittedly paints a little bit of a bleak picture, but if you've ever been up there in the winter or in the late fall, that's what it is. So I grew up in, my hometown is Ashland, and the main industries are potatoes and lumber. There's not really much to do. If you want to go to the big city, Presque Isle, you got to drive 30 minutes. So growing up there, I always loved landscape. You have a lot of forests and fields and just an amazingly open sky. But I always felt like a little bit of an outsider because I didn't do all the fun county things that people do, like hunting and fishing. I wanted to be inside with my books, largely thanks to my mom back there, who introduced my sister and me to books even before we were born. She and dad would read to us. When we were old enough, we would read to them. And it just became, it was just a foundational part of me that I grew up with, you know, appreciating the power of story. And another part of feeling like an outsider in Ashland was the fact that I was born with 2 heart defects. And so I spent most of my first 6 years in and out of hospitals, including having 2 open heart surgeries. And so, you know, it's not really a fun child. Like, that's not fun to be doing that. But having books was a way to kind of escape all of that trauma. I could really put myself in a different world. And so I had books as a way to lift myself out of my town, which was, you know, like I said, beautiful, but I didn't feel exactly right there. But books also lifted me out of all of the trauma and anxiety I was experiencing as part of my experiences as a cardiac patient. So this was the early 90s, and there wasn't a lot of language in rural Maine, northern rural Maine, about what trauma does to a body, what trauma does to your mind. And so growing up, I remember I would be convinced that if I fell asleep first, like the house would catch fire and it would be my fault. Or I would be sure that something terrible was going to happen at any second. And I always had this impending feeling of doom, which, you know, looking back now, I see that that was part of the trauma response of, you know, I learned very early on, I could die at any second. It was just my reality. So while other kids were running around on the monkey bars, I was like, oh, we might get hit by lightning and die. So there was quite a difference between that. And it wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I really started exploring how that trauma lived in my body and still lives in my body, and how it affected me with my anxiety and with my bouts of depression. And so I've started to become really open about talking about it, because we didn't talk about it when I was a kid, and I wish we would have. And I don't blame anyone for it, because it was the 90s. But a big part of this book is mental health and what happens when we don't talk about these heavy subjects. And what happens to one of the characters in this book is, you know, obviously a dramatized version of what could happen. But the feelings associated with it of just loneliness and remembering trauma, I very much identify with. So I'm going to read you a little bit of Bridget's story, Bridget's chapter. She's a young mother and she's having a hard time. And we would understand it as postpartum depression. But back then, you couldn't really talk about it. It was 1990. She feels a lot of shame. She doesn't feel comfortable telling anyone what she's experiencing. So we're going to go into that, and it is heavy, but then we're going to segue into lighter things. So bear with me. This is from the chapter On the Edge of Town. Bridget used to dream in color: emerald, crimson, indigo, saffron, coral, sunset. But ever since the baby came, her dreams are blanched of color, only black and gray. Her nightmare images: crooked houses, many stories high, buildings collapsing brick by brick, are swollen like wet paper, soaked through with despair. Even in her dreams, the baby is always crying. Nate wakes Bridget early in the morning, his lips soft and warm on her mouth. Down the hall, the baby is finally quiet, sleeping. I have to go to work, Nate says. His words brim with love that makes Bridget feel heavy. I could try to sneak home for lunch or supper, but that might be tricky. Bruce and I have to go over the plan. Plan? I told you, remember? Tonight's the night we're arresting Tommy. It's going to be a long day. I'm sorry. His words seemed to come to her from a distance Bridget stopped trying to cross days or weeks or maybe even months ago. It doesn't matter. All those words mean is that he won't be home with her today. She will be alone again. Maybe you should call my mom or yours, Nate says. That somber black uniform, clean lines against his broad shoulders, narrow waist. On his hip, the small but heavy gun. I hate leaving you here all by yourself. Somewhere inside her, buried as if beneath a dozen feet of snow, all the right words are there. Digging them up takes nearly all the energy Bridget will need for everything else today. Breathing, leaving this room, feeding the baby, changing the baby, carrying the baby around the house, hours and hours of pacing that never lead anywhere. Carrying the lies too, the story Bridget's built up over the past 6, or is it 7 months. She feeds one of these lies to Nate now. Don't worry, she says. I'll be all right. She throws back the sheet and gets out of bed just to show him how normal things are. Normal mothers do this. Normal mothers greet the day, bursting bright with sunshine, and smile. She smiles. Her lips feel like wax. Nate pauses in the doorway of the bedroom as she slips into her bathrobe and stares at her a moment longer than he usually would. Are you sure everything's okay? I'm okay, just tired. His eyes search her face, then he lets out a long breath and nods. Smiles. Smiles because he believes her. That's Nate. Steady no matter what. Steady when everything and everyone else falls apart around him. He reaches out for her and Bridget lifts her hand toward his. Maybe that one touch could do it. Bring her back to something safe and familiar. It always used to. Her small hand in his river blue eyes keeping her afloat. It's been this way since 2nd grade, when he offered her his moon pie after she dropped her butterscotch pudding on the cafeteria floor. The pudding stained her best pink tights. Her mother would be furious. The oversized wooden spoon reserved for spanking might come down from the clean white kitchen wall. Nate didn't know that. He just knew Bridget needed something, and a marshmallow moon was all he had to give. Their hands met as he gave it over, and that one touch broke through something inside Bridget. All better? He asked, and it wasn't the ruined tights, the punishment waiting when she got home. But in that moment, with Nate beside her, everything felt okay. She steps toward him now, only centimeters between them, a shadow, a breath. Down the hall, the baby shrieks. Nate turns away toward the awful sound. After he leaves, the baby cries harder. Bridget stands beside the crib and stares at the red-faced creature sprawled and kicking there. Disgust twists inside her like a parasite, and to think she once longed to be a mother. The night she found out she was pregnant, Bridget and Nate had a candlelit dinner in their kitchen, still mostly bare of furniture. The fridge containing little other than bologna and leftover pizza from the store and more. Unpacked boxes all around them. Swatches of new paint on every wall. Butter up in the kitchen, peachy queen in the living room, strawberry moon in the upstairs bath. They'd only been married a couple months, but they had been together for most of their 25 years of living in this tiny town at the top of Maine, surrounded by sky and wilderness. Bridget sometimes dreamed of other places, deserts where earth bumped against heaven, purple mountains that balanced the sun on their jagged white crowns, but she never dreamed of another man. Nate seemed to dream only of what he already had. Are you sure? He kept saying after she told him the news. Are you sure? Awed by the hugeness of it. Timid smile and orange candle glow. It was unplanned, but not unwanted. Earlier than they'd imagined. But what in this life arrives at the moment one might expect? A baby, Bridget said. A baby, he said, and kissed her long and slow. She fell asleep that night and dreamed of colors for the nursery. Not pink, not blue, something instead to reflect the only land she and Nate had ever known, the one they both loved. Forest, field, river flowing beyond the pines, a shade of green, a slice of life. Something that sparked happiness, something that would wake their baby with wonder and make him, or her, grateful for the earth and all its riches. Now, Bridget stands stretched flat and pale between walls of verdant viridian and wishes the baby, still crying, hadn't woken up at all. So let's take a little breather. So writing that chapter was very difficult, even though I'm not a mom, even though I haven't experienced exactly what Bridget is experiencing. I've definitely had those bouts of depression and anxiety and feeling alone. And I wrote this book during COVID. And when it came time to write that particular chapter, which I'd put off for a very long time because I knew it was going to be difficult, I was dealing with my own health struggles and I was having the worst depression I'd had in years. So lots of fun to write that chapter. But I think that as difficult as it was, I really needed to connect to my past trauma and anxiety to understand what Bridget was going through. And so even though I'll always struggle with PTSD, I'm kind of grateful for it in a way because it allows me to understand my characters in a way that I couldn't otherwise. And I feel like the big difference between Bridget and me is Bridget doesn't have an outlet. She doesn't have a way to make herself feel better. Whereas I've always had writing as a tool to manage my own anxiety and my own depression. But I always had my hometown as well. And so Bridget's kind of become very separated from her town. She's living with Nate in this house on the outskirts of town. She doesn't go into town. But I had this community that was always rallying around me. And, you know, we would go have coffee with my mom's friend, Jody, who we called the queen because she deserves the thing. And I had great friends. And so even though I was struggling mentally, I had a community of people. And I think that growing up in Ashland, even though I never felt like I fit in there, especially now that I haven't been there in a long time, I can look back and see how lucky I was to have so many great people around me. Because number one, they helped me with what I was dealing with at the time, but they've also given me endless material for the writing, and writing helps me deal with the stuff too. So it's all kind of a nice full circle moment. And it reminds me that a place like Dalton, on one side, it is bad that you can't talk about mental health. You can't talk about what you're struggling with. There's a lot of silence and there's a lot of secrets. But a place is never just one thing. And so even though you have that side of Dalton, you also have this side where everybody is incredibly supportive and connected with one another. And there's a lot of love and humor and hope in this town. And so that's when I look back at my town, I remember that stuff more than I remember the, oh my God, I'm gonna die in this small town type of feeling. And I'm really grateful that I can look back on that. And so I thought that I would finish the reading section by giving a better look at what can be possible in a town like Dalton. And that's, I think in small towns anywhere, there's a really lovely thing that happens where you can be 14 and you can be friends with a 40-year-old librarian. And it's not that weird. You have these multi-generational relationships. The queen that I was talking about, I would sometimes go spend time with her by myself and it felt completely natural. I feel like in a town like that, you're just looking for connection anywhere across age and experience. And so I thought it was appropriate, since we're library workers, that I share a little bit from my librarian's chapter. Her name is Trudy. She's a bit of a pill, but she has a very soft heart. And after the event, she's struggling. Things have changed for her, just like they've changed for everybody else. But her best friend, Bev, who is maybe a little bit more than a best friend, she's still in the background looking out for Trudy. And she does that by kind of pushing a teenage boy named Greg, who's struggling with his own identity, into going to Trudy's house and helping her garden. And so the relationship between Greg and Trudy is one of my favorites. And so we're going to just give you a little bit of that now. A lot to look at, but not much to see. This is the first thought that flits through Trudy's mind when she opens the door to see Greg Fortin standing on her front porch in a B-52's t-shirt. 14 years old and wide enough to block out the sun. A yellow Walkman the size of a brick pokes out the back pocket of his jeans. Light brown hair matted to his temples with sweat. He smells sweet, like the powdered sugar donuts on display near the cash register up at Bergeron's. By the looks of Greg, Trudy guesses his mother doesn't try too hard to stop him from adding those donuts to the conveyor belt at the last minute. Impulse buyers. Trudy has almost as little patience for impulse buyers as she does for people who come into the library expecting her to find a book when they don't even know the title or the author. But I'm pretty sure it's got a blue cover, or maybe green. Hey, Mrs. Haskell. Greg offers up a shy smile, revealing a line of clean, mostly straight teeth. Dad said he heard you'd pay a few bucks for someone to help you in your garden. No need for that damn formality. Trudy hasn't spoken yet this morning, and the phlegmy sound of her voice makes her feel off-balanced, embarrassed. I may be married, but I'm no missus. And who said I needed help? Greg shrugs. Some customer, I guess? Jim Fortin owns the hardware store, and Cheryl, a stay-at-home mom, makes Christmas wreaths out of her garage. Trudy regularly sees Greg's sisters at the library. Sarah, 17, likes Jane Austen, and Amy, still in grade school, has been stuck on the Babysitters Club for a year. But it's been a while since Greg came in. Last winter, maybe, before he saved the Muse girl when she fell through the ice down at the river. Trudy doesn't recall the boy being quite so rotund the last time he checked out a stack of books. But she does remember he had better literary taste than the average teen. Steinbeck and Rachel Carson, Baldwin, and Louise Dickinson Rich. Trudy steps onto the porch, pulling the screen door shut so Mycroft can't sneak outside. She can hear him in the kitchen, his double paws padding across the freshly swept laminate. Do I seem like someone who needs help? Do I look old, arthritic? Greg takes in Trudy's lounge pants, her bleach-stained sweatshirt. She can smell her hands, the lemon vinegar solution she was pouring down the kitchen sink when he knocked on her door. No, he says, but maybe you could give me some work anyway. No, she doesn't want any help, especially not from some kid who probably can't tell a pansy from a petunia. Can the boy even get down on the ground to weed or haul himself back up again? Then she hears a voice in her head that sounds an awful lot like Bev. Damn it, True, don't be such a grouch. Do you know anything about gardening? Mom and I tried to grow tomatoes once. Were they edible? Not really, but Dad says you need help with flowers, not tomatoes. How much do you expect to be paid? Whatever you think is fair. And what could a boy your age so desperately need money for? Porn, booze, and cigarettes, what else? Playful glint in his brown eyes. Trudy can't help it. She laughs. The boy might have something she doesn't come across often here in Dalton. Fire. I'm too busy to teach you anything today, Trudy says. But if you come by first thing tomorrow morning, I'll let you do some weeding. I might even feed you if you're still here at lunchtime. Cool, he says. I like egg salad. Trudy watches until Greg reaches the end of Winter Street and turns left onto Howard, that yellow Walkman flashing under the sun. The air smells like spent flowers. Heat bugs whine from the hemlock trees. Summer, dying slowly. So that's Greg and Trudy, and I love that very much. But I think that their relationship speaks to the better parts of Dalton. The community, the watching out for one another, the unexpected relationships that come in a town like that. And I feel like Greg is a character who could easily go into his own mental health crisis, but I think that having Trudy is very good for him. And I like thinking that maybe I've saved him in a way, but really he saved himself because the characters tell me what they want to do. So I guess just to close out, I'm grateful you're all here. I'm grateful I'm in my library talking about my book. And I'm really grateful for the town that raised me, so I could write this book and release it into the world. And now I'm happy to take questions.
The purely practical one. You're a very busy professional in this library, and presumably you have a life outside here as well. When do you fit in the time to write a book?
Right.
And such a wonderful, all-encompassing book like this.
Thank you. So in case people online didn't hear, she asked how I balance my work here at the library with my regular life with writing. I work part-time here, so I've kind of structured my schedule in a way that works for my creative side. I don't have a lot of a life other than writing. We like to stay at home. We like to hang out with our cat. So it's pretty easy for me to find time at home to do all of the writing. But I do, this summer has been a little bit crazy with all of the author events. They've been wonderful, but it has stretched me a little thin to do all of the pieces of my life and do all of them as well as I can. I feel like I'm spinning lots of plates and a couple of them might have fallen on the ground. But, you know, I think I've learned a lot in the process, and hopefully for book number 2, I'll have a better balance in place.
And have you started book number 3?
So book number 2, Where the Forest Meets the River, has been written, has been bought by Europa.
Oh.
Yes, I'm very excited. We don't have a publication date yet. Hopefully as early as next fall, but that could, you know, there's a lot of things that could happen in the publishing world, so no final decision yet, but as soon as I know, I will be telling everybody I know. Yeah, I'm very excited about it.
So is this a sequel?
Yes.
Oh my God.
So this takes place in 1990, the next book is in 95. So you get to check in with all the same characters, see what they're up to. Greg is there again, but he's 19, he's home from college, so he's a little bit older and wiser. And it was really nice for me to see what they were doing, how the event affected them, you know, 5 years on. And there's a couple new characters who I hope add to the mix. And a couple of the characters who had a voice in this one are kind of just periphery figures in the next one. But the central cast is the same.
And book 3?
Has not been written yet. But my plan is to do 1990, 1995. The next one might take place in 96, but maybe I'll find a way to stretch it till the end of the decade. So we have that nice span of the 90s. That's when I grew up in my hometown. So I very much identify with the 90s. The Goo Goo Dolls are on my playlist. You'll get that reference for them. But yeah, I think it would be it would feel nice to just have that 90 end of 99. There's a decade of Dalton. And then maybe I'll stretch my writer wings and, you know, stay in the Dalton universe, but try some new characters and some new time periods. Yeah.
Those in your describing the elements of the town that you added the psychological trials that many of the characters go through, but you didn't bring in, there was no mention of religion, pastors, you know, and I was just wondering why, and sometimes in towns, in small towns, that's a source of separation, or at least distinction. There's more than one church in a town of 1,300 people, that might be the case.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what your thinking was.
Yeah. So the question is, why didn't religion kind of play a role in the book? Which I agree, in a lot of small towns, religion plays a very central role. I think that religion was definitely there in my hometown. We had the Advent church, we had the Catholic church, congregational. But I didn't feel like it shaped my life. I went to Sunday school, I had friends, and I would go to youth group, but it felt like there was no clash between denominations that I noticed, but maybe that's because I was a kid and I didn't see it. But I just didn't feel a strong religious influence in Ashland. And I didn't even really, there's a Pastor Ray, he's there in maybe a couple scenes, but I don't know, I think I just wanted to, I'm not a religious person. I wanted to write beyond that. And I think that in Dalton, church is there, but it's not a leading force.
It was so much a part of the community.
Yeah,
There wasn't a label of, oh, they're Adventists, they're Catholics.
Right.
Everybody was one community.
Yeah.
And I think there was a belief in higher power of God.
Yeah.
Within the community, but there wasn't a structure of.
Yeah.
So much.
that's my mom.
Sorry.
My mom answered the question better than I did. You're right, with a small community like that, it's like we were all one thing. And you're right, people probably shared the same belief in a higher power, but we were all in it together. Thanks, Mom.
We have questions on Zoom.
Okay,
Pam asks, what are the reasons you included the paradox of heroism and rescue for several of the characters?
that's a really good question. I think so. The book started with Nate Thoreau, the rookie cop, and I knew, and it also started with Dr. Haskell, and I knew that both of them have some of that hero complex. And I think that Dr. Haskell likes it a little bit more than Nate does. I think that Nate just kind of trundles along naively, not really. I love Nate, but he's got a lot to learn. But then I thought, what about characters who are heroic, but they don't want to be? And that's where Greg comes in when he saves his friend from the river. And it did become I didn't intend for it to be, but it did become a recurring theme. This idea of who can save other people, what can't be saved, what shouldn't be saved. And it's one of those things that it just developed in the writing, but I don't know that it was strictly intentional from a craft perspective, if I sat down and thought about it. Hannah's a writer too, so I'm looking at her. She knows that kind of things happen you don't expect to happen. And that's kind of what happened with the heroism rescue type thing.
Here's another question from Zoom, kind of in that same vein. Ron says he loved the book, and he noticed that the narration is particularly attentive to scents, aromas, and odors in most every scene of characters, places, and events. Is that a conscious emphasis or something more subconscious? Adds a lot to the imagery.
That one is conscious. That one was very, very intentional. To write a scene, I need to feel like I'm there. And I think good writing employs all 5 senses. Whether I'm reading something or writing something, I need to feel that. And so it was nice that even though I'm writing about a fictional town, I could draw on my actual scent, taste, smell memories of Ashland. You know, like the smell of sawdust and the sound of Jake brakes as the trucks are coming into town. I feel like sensory language brings a place to life, and Dalton very much had to be alive in this book because it's the leading influence on all the other characters. And so very intentional. I want you to feel like you're there. The best way to do that is make you physically feel like you're there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned craft right now, and I was wondering, you hold an MFA from Suncoast, and I was wondering how that influenced your development as a writer and how that is the creation of the book itself.
Right. So I graduated from Orono in 2012, and then I didn't start my MFA until about 8 or 10 years later. So in that time, I was writing a lot of short stories independently. I had some pretty good success getting them into publication, but I kind of hit a creative wall. And so I had resisted the MFA for a very long time. But then when I finally decided the universe was telling me, you gotta do it, not so much because I wanted to say I have a master's, but because I knew I needed a writing community. I knew I needed some new inspiration and some new guidance. So part of the program was you had to write a thesis. And I had this idea of, I've been writing about Dalton all these years. They're kind of like disparate stories. Nate had been living in my mind for a long time. So I knew I wanted to write something about him. So I decided my thesis would be a linked collection. It began as a linked collection of these Dalton stories. But I wanted it to read a little bit like Olive Kittredge or Winesburg, Ohio, where you could read one story alone and it would be enough, or you could read it as a novel. So Stone Coast was really, I worked with a few different mentors who helped me make that work. The structure part of it was really intense to make it right. So this book actually couldn't exist. I mean, it could exist, but it would be very, very different and not very good if I hadn't done. I learned a lot of really, really good things at Stone Coast. I had great mentors. Susan Conley, who's a local.
And we'll be here on October
With Melanie Brooks, who was another Stone Coast person. We weren't in the same cohort, but I know her vaguely. Ron Curry Jr., who grew up in Waterville. And Aaron Hamburger is not a Mainer, but we're gonna forgive him because he was incredible. And he was my first mentor in my first semester. And he was really essential in helping me figure out what the book wanted to be. And he was also really great with line edits. He loves grammar as much as I do, so that was good. So, yeah, thank you.
There's another process question
Sure.
on Zoom, which is a good follow-up to that. Trisha wants to know how you found Europa as a publisher. And she also says that the book has such a great cover and design, and there's French flags. Maybe you can hold it up to show it.
French flaps. So my path to Europa was, I'll try to make it short, but when I finished the thesis, it was done enough for me to know that I wanted to get it published. So I had just started querying agents. I think I'd sent out about 12 queries to different agents. And then a short story I had published in the Raleigh Review got the attention of Nat Sobel, an agent in the big city. And he reached out to Raleigh Review, who reached out to me to ask if I had anything, full manuscript. And I said, I just happen to have a full manuscript, yes. So Nat read it. He thought that his partner Judith would be a better fit for me as an agent. So she and I worked together on edits for a couple months. So this was early 2021. We went on submission in April 2021. She sent it to about 30 different editors and imprints and houses before Europa said yes. Every other place said it was too quiet and they didn't know how to sell it. And Europa said, we know how to sell it. And I think that they've done a great job. It's been really lovely to work with a smaller indie. My editor is amazing. She goes above and beyond what an editor should do. She helps me a lot with PR, which is not super common. It's been great. And remind me what the cover design.
Yes.
So the team at Europa came up with the cover design and I didn't have any idea what to expect. And when they initially sent it to me, these greens were like purple and yellow. And I said, no, that looks like Florida. We're not in Florida. So then I thought, how about more of an earthy tone? So they came back with red, like a reddish brown, and it looked like a slab of steak. I said, no. I said, why don't you try green? Because when I think of the county, I think of greens and blues with the skies and the fields. And actually in each chapter, I kind of call attention to those colors because it's very much how I remember the county. And so they came back with this one. And I realized there is a picture that my mom took from, she was paddling down the Aroostook River just outside of our hometown. And she took a picture of a farmhouse in the field, and it looks remarkably similar to this. And I had held that picture secretly in my mind whenever I was writing about Nate Thoreau's farmhouse or the farmhouse where Alice lives with her husband Roger. And so when it came to me, it was another full circle moment where it felt very fateful that I had told no one that I had that picture in my mind, and that's what they saw. So it was very exciting. Any others? Should we go into buying? Oh, it's fine.
I have another question on, the linked story concept.
Yes.
How, you said it started as a linked collection and then you wanted to bring it into a novel.
Yeah.
Was there much revision in that process, or was it kind of your idea all along?
Yeah.
So, I mean, did you have to reorder?
There was quite a bit of revision, but it did help that I had planned it structurally that way. But we added a little bit more drama. Initially, all of the things going on with Tommy, maybe selling drugs, were just kind of anecdotal things going in the background, but then we realized there was an opportunity to raise the stakes a little bit. So Tommy became more of a player. Unfortunately, nobody likes Tommy, he's a jerk. But I do think that he plays a pivotal role in Nate's development. So I think that was the biggest change that we made, and I think that it really served the book, and it gave it a lot more depth than it had before. And there were a few stories that didn't make it into the final cut, that didn't really fit in with everything else. And there were a few additions. Richard's chapter at the end where he's struggling and he's going to the diner and eating really bad food. That was a late addition. And when Nate's father goes hunting with his friends, that was a later addition. But again, I feel like both of those chapters bring the book a lot more depth than it did before. So I was very pleased with the process, and I was glad I was open-minded to what my editor and my agent were suggesting. Because sometimes you want to resist as the artist, but I'm glad that I listened to the advice in this case. But sometimes I still think of it as a collection of short stories. And I don't mind if other people do too. It's a book. You can call it whatever you want. Yeah.
Along the same line of like short stories, I was thinking about this after last time we heard you. Because like short stories is not a very common genre in literature. But you and Morgan Tully both did like short stories. Was that something that someone was not pushed, but something that they suggested, or tried like short stories? Or
it was not suggested to us. It just kind of happened. And I think that Morgan's success in particular has proven that people do want short story collections. I think that a lot of times I don't have time to read a novel, but I do have time to read a story. And maybe when I pick it up next time, I'll be like, oh, this is fun to figure out how it's connected to the past story. So I'm hopeful that the genre will gain a little bit more traction now. I think that smaller indies are more willing to put them out onto the market, but I think that there's a lot of resistance from the big five, which hopefully will change. But it's just a trope and also an unfortunate reality in publishing that novels sell better. So I have a lot of feelings about that. But yeah, Morgan, if you haven't read Morgan's collection, it's very good. I recommend it.
And the second book is also linked stories.
The second book is a little bit, so this one has longer chapters. The second book has much shorter chapters. And I think I wrote the second, it took me 2 years to write this one. It took me 7 months to write the second one. And I think part of the reason I could write it that quickly was the shorter chapters. It's still in multiple perspectives. But I keep going back to the same characters, so you get to know them a little bit more. So it feels a little bit different structurally. The second one reads much more like a traditional novel than this one, I think. We'll see if that works in the long run. Yeah.
Yes, another question. You spoke about, well, previously about how you decided on present tense in the book. I wonder, because I really like and pause in second person, which is really weird. As you know, it's not, it's a very, the most uncommon perspective
Yes.
in a novel.
Yeah.
But I really, really like that.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, how it was, I'm guessing it was a conscious decision to do it in the second person as opposed to the rest of it, which is all third person.
Yes. So with the prologue being in second person present tense, I wanted to immediately bring the reader in. And the best way to do that is address them directly. You're on this road. You're in this town. So there isn't a separation between reader and story. So that was very intentional. And the use of present tense in the remainder of the book, I personally just like writing in present tense better. It's easier when I'm writing in flashback. I don't have to think about he had that. I can just say he had that. And I think that it brings a lot more immediacy to the narrative. And even though it's set in 1990, I want you to feel like it's happening now. So both of those were very conscientious decisions. How are we doing on time with Terry having to head out?
Let's take another one or two
Okay.
questions,
Yep.
and then we should wrap up so that we can make sure to get the books.
Okay.
Or everybody's
Yeah, if
also
everyone's,
just ready to go.
Yeah. That's fine too. You guys have been great. Thank you for laughing in all the right places. I've been to events where it's hard to read the crowd and sometimes they don't laugh and I just, so I appreciate that it's felt very interactive. So
Have you been back to the county?
I did, I went to my hometown library and I was really nervous.
Yeah.
I didn't want anyone to feel like I had capitalized on their experience. And even though none of the characters and none of the events are based on anything real, a lot of people read them like, oh, that's me. That's my neighbor. And I can't control that. I I told them at the event, but people are gonna think what they think. But it was really lovely. My old teachers were there, and that's the library where I would go and get all the books that I would read to my parents. And so it felt incredibly wonderful. And I went right to the old children's section and I found the old Babysitters Club books. And even though as a library worker, I thought, oh my God, they really should read this collection. I found they still have the date due slips in the back and we would write our card numbers in there. And I found books with my card number in it and my sister's. So that was pretty awesome. Yeah. Okay, and I'm signing. I think I'm gonna try to sit at a table. It's a little bit easier to sign. Or should we back there maybe?
Yeah.
There's a sector there.
Please, little over there.
Yeah, I'll go over there to sign. So thank you all for coming.